My family humiliated me for being a welder my entire life. But when I alone cared for my dying uncle and he left me 70 acres and $400K, my brother forged his will and now faces fraud charges. I'm 24 years old, work as a welder and do hunting guides on weekends, and I guess I've always been the black sheep of my family. You know, the guy who didn't go to college, who doesn't have an office job, who basically disappointed everyone by choosing to work with my hands instead of sitting behind a desk. My father, Gregory, is a lawyer. My mother, Margaret, was a registered nurse but retired years ago. And my siblings, well, they did meet expectations. Kyle is like 29 and owns a chain of gyms. 3 or 4 locations, I think. Nathan is 27 and runs some kind of tech startup that I don't understand anything about, but apparently he's doing really well. And my sister Jessica, who's 31, married Brandon, who's a corporate lawyer, and basically lives in a house that looks like it came out of a magazine. And then there's me, Connor, the welder who smells like metal and oil when he shows up to family dinners. The thing is, there was always one person in my family who never made me feel like a failure, and that was my great-uncle Frank. Frank was like 78 years old when all this started. He had been a lawyer too in his time, but got tired of that life and moved to a cabin in the middle of nowhere when he was 50-something. He had 70 acres of land, pure forest, a small lake, and this rustic cabin that he had renovated himself over the years. I used to go visit him when I was a teenager. He taught me to hunt, to fish, to fix things, and never, not once, did he ask me when I was going to get a real job or when I was going to do something with my life. He just accepted me. And when I told him I had gotten my welding certification and was working at a factory, he told me that was exactly what the world needed. People who knew how to build things with their own hands. The rest of my family basically ignored him. I mean, they'd show up at Christmas if anything, send him a generic birthday card, but nobody really spent time with him. To them, Frank was the weird uncle who had given up, a successful career to live like a hermit in the woods. I remember Jessica once said at a family dinner that it was a shame Frank had wasted his potential. And Nathan laughed and commented something about how I'd probably end up the same way. Everyone laughed except my mother, who just looked at me with that expression of disappointment I already knew too well. Like 2.5 years ago, around March or April 2023, I think, Frank called me and said he needed to tell me something. I went to visit him that weekend, drove like 2 hours to his cabin, and when I got there, he looked different. Thinner, more tired. I sat with him on the porch. His dog Maisie was lying at our feet, an old golden retriever who was already like 12 years old. And Frank told me straight out, no beating around the bush, that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, he explained, and the doctors had given him maybe 6 months, a year, if he was lucky. I don't know what you're supposed to say when someone tells you something like that. I just sat there, looking at the trees, feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach, and all I could say was something stupid like we were going to fight this together. Frank just smiled and told me no, that he knew how things were going to end, but that he appreciated me being there. He asked if I could visit more often, help him with some things around the property that he couldn't do alone anymore, and of course I said yes. I called my family that night to tell them. The reaction was, well, exactly what you'd expect. My father said he was sorry to hear that Frank should consider moving to some kind of assisted living facility. Kyle was busy with the opening of his 4th gym and basically said he'd keep Frank in his thoughts. Nathan said something about how that was part of the natural cycle of life. Very philosophical of him, I guess. And Jessica cried a little on the phone, but then said, with the kids and everything, she wouldn't be able to visit much. My mother was the only one who actually seemed affected, but when I suggested maybe we could take turns visiting him so he wouldn't have to go through this alone, she just said I lived closer anyway, that it made more sense for me to take care of it. So that's what I did. I started visiting Frank 2 or 3 times a week. I cut my hours at the factory to 4 days instead of 5, stopped taking as many guide jobs on weekends, and basically spent the next 1.5 years helping my great-uncle get through the worst of it. Some days we'd just sit and fish, didn't talk much, just enjoyed being together. Other days he felt bad from the chemo and I'd just stay there, making him tea, making sure he took his medications, taking Maisie for walks because Frank didn't have the energy to do it anymore. What's incredible, or maybe not so incredible if you know my family, is that basically nobody else showed up. Kyle came once, spent like 20 minutes, took some photos with Frank for his Instagram, where he wrote something about valuing family, and then left saying he had an important meeting. Nathan showed up twice in all that time. Both visits lasted less than an hour, and he basically spent most of the time on his phone handling some crisis with his company. Jessica never came. Not once. She always had some excuse. The kids were sick. Brandon had to work. She had an important social event. My father visited Frank maybe 3 or 4 times total, brief and awkward conversations where they basically talked about the weather and nothing else. My mother came more often, maybe once a month, but her visits always seemed more about fulfilling an obligation than actually wanting to be there. Frank never complained about this. He never said anything negative about my family, but I could see in his eyes that he knew. That he understood that to them, he was just an old man dying in the woods, not someone who deserved their time or attention. One night, we were sitting on his porch. It was summer and hot, but there was a nice breeze. And Frank told me he appreciated everything I was doing for him. I told him he didn't have to thank me, that it was the least I could do. And he looked at me with that serious expression he got when he wanted to say something important and told me, "Connor, you're the only one in this family who understands what really matters." Those words stuck with me. I remember them perfectly, even now. Around August last year, when Frank had been dealing with cancer for like a year and a half, I started noticing my family was suddenly very interested in knowing how he was doing. Kyle called me out of the blue, asking about Frank's property, if the cabin was in good condition, how many acres he had exactly. Nathan sent me a message asking if Frank had mentioned anything about his finances, if he had a plan for his estate. Jessica, who hadn't lifted a finger to help this whole time, called me crying, saying she felt bad about not being more present, that she wanted to visit Frank soon, that the kids missed their great uncle, even though honestly I doubt the kids even knew him well. My mother organized a family dinner in September, said it would be good for all of us to be together, especially with Frank being so sick. When I arrived, everyone was there. It was weird because usually it's hard to coordinate something with everyone. Someone's always busy or has other plans. But that day everyone showed up, and it didn't take long before the conversation turned toward Frank. Jessica started by saying they had been thinking, her and Brandon, that it would be nice if the cabin could stay in the family, that maybe they could use it for family vacations. Kyle said yeah, that they should definitely consider keeping the property, that it could be a good investment. Nathan, being Nathan, started talking about the market value of the land, how much they could get if they decided to sell, though personally, I thought it would be better to develop something there, maybe rental cabins or something like that. I sat there, listening to my family basically planning what to do with Frank's things as if he were already dead, and I felt this rage growing in my chest. I finally said something like, maybe we should focus on Frank right now instead of planning what to do with his things, and everyone went quiet for a moment. My father said they were just being practical, that these conversations were necessary. Jessica looked at me and said, "Besides, Connor, it's not like you could maintain a place like that. You don't have the resources for it." That last part hurt more than I'd like to admit, because she was basically saying I wasn't good enough, successful enough, to deserve anything Frank might leave. I didn't say anything else at that dinner. I finished eating, said thanks, and left. I drove straight to Frank's cabin even though it was late, like 9 at night, and when I got there the lights were on. Frank was awake, sitting in his favorite chair with Maisie at his feet, and as soon as he saw me come in, he knew something was wrong. I told him about the dinner, about how my family was basically fighting over his things while he was still alive, and Frank just nodded like he wasn't surprised at all. He told me he had changed his will a few months ago. He explained that the cabin, the 70 acres, and $200,000 he had saved specifically for renovations and maintenance of the property, all of that was going to be mine. The rest of his savings, which was quite a bit considering he had been a lawyer for 25 years before retiring, was going to go to different charitable organizations, wildlife conservation groups, and things like that. I asked him why he was telling me this, and he said he wanted me to know, to understand that this decision had nothing to do with hurting the rest of the family, but with rewarding the only person who had really cared about him. Honestly, I didn't know what to say. I tried to tell him he didn't have to do that, that I took care of him because I loved him, not because I expected something in return. And Frank interrupted me and said, "I know, Connor. That's why I'm doing this." He explained he had talked to his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, that everything was legally in order, that he had made his intentions very clear. He made me promise I wouldn't say anything to my family until after he was gone, that he wanted his last months to be peaceful without family drama, and I promised I wouldn't say a word. The last few months were hard. Frank got worse quickly after Christmas. He couldn't walk without help anymore, barely ate, spent most of his time asleep or in that state of semi-consciousness where you're neither awake nor asleep. I basically moved into the cabin in February, slept on the couch, made sure he was comfortable, that he wasn't in pain. Maisie wouldn't leave his side. She'd lie next to his bed all day, like she also knew he was saying goodbye. My family called occasionally, asking how Frank was, but nobody offered to come help. Nobody asked if I needed a break or if there was anything they could do. It was like they assumed I had everything under control, or maybe they just didn't care enough to offer. The only one who came to visit him in those last months was my mother. She showed up twice, stayed maybe an hour each time, cried a little, and then left. Frank died on a Tuesday morning in late March. I was there, holding his hand, and Maisie was lying next to him with her head on his chest. He just stopped breathing, very peacefully, no visible pain, and just like that he was gone. I called hospice services, made all the necessary arrangements, and then called my family to give them the news. The reaction was predictable. Everyone said they were so sorry to hear that Frank had been a great man, that they were going to miss him. Jessica cried on the phone. Nathan said something about how, at least Frank wasn't suffering anymore. Kyle said, "We should have a nice funeral to honor him." My father asked about the arrangements, who was going to take care of what, and I told him Frank had left specific instructions with his lawyer, and everything was being handled. The funeral was small. Frank hadn't wanted anything elaborate, just a simple ceremony, cremation, and his ashes to be scattered on his property. My whole family showed up, of course, all dressed in black, all with their appropriately sad faces. It was awkward because I could feel the tension. Everyone was waiting for something. Probably waiting for the reading of the will. Waiting to know what they were going to get. A week after the funeral, Mr. Harrison, Frank's lawyer, organized a meeting for the reading of the will. We all met at his office. It was a small, old-fashioned place with bookshelves up to the ceiling and that smell of old paper. My family was there, all sitting in these uncomfortable chairs, and I could see in their faces they were anxious. Jessica kept adjusting her hair. Nathan was checking his phone every 2 minutes. Kyle was fidgeting in his seat. Mr. Harrison started reading the legal formalities, all that formal language that basically nobody understands, and then he got to the important part. He said Frank had made his intentions very clear, that he had updated his will 6 months ago, and that all his mental faculties had been verified at that time. Then he read the part about the property. The cabin and the 70 acres were going to Connor, meaning me, along with $200,000 specifically designated for maintenance and improvements of the property. The rest of his estate, which was approximately $500,000 after taxes and expenses, was going to be divided among 3 charitable organizations Frank had specified. The silence that followed was like that moment before a storm breaks. My family sat there, processing what they had just heard, and I could see their faces changing, from confusion to shock to what I can only describe as pure rage. Jessica was the first to explode. She stood up from her chair screaming that this couldn't be real, that there had to be some mistake. Brandon tried to calm her down, but she completely ignored him, kept screaming that this was a scam, that obviously I had manipulated Frank, that he was sick and confused and I had taken advantage of that. Kyle joined in, saying he was going to fight this, that there was no way they were going to let this happen, that clearly I had influenced Frank when he was vulnerable. Nathan, being the most calculating of all, stayed quiet at first, just observing, but then said something about how this didn't make sense from a logical perspective, that Frank had always talked about keeping things in the family, that obviously something was wrong here. My father, with that lawyer voice he uses when he's trying to intimidate someone, asked Mr. Harrison if there was any basis to question the validity of the will. Mr. Harrison, who had been Frank's friend for decades, looked at them all with an expression I can only describe as professional disgust. He explained that Frank had been very clear about his intentions, that he had updated his will voluntarily, that he had been evaluated by 2 independent doctors who confirmed his mental capacity, and that there was no legal basis to dispute it. He also mentioned, and this was like rubbing salt in the wound, that Frank had left a letter explaining his decisions, and if they wanted, he could read it. My mother said yes, please read it, maybe hoping the letter would say something that would change the situation. Mr. Harrison took out an envelope and started reading in Frank's voice, or well, his words at least. The letter basically said he had made this decision because Connor had been the only one who really cared about him, the only one who sacrificed his time and energy to take care of him when he was dying, while the rest of the family had basically abandoned him. Frank wrote that he wasn't doing this out of resentment, but because he wanted his property to go to someone who would really appreciate it and respect it, someone who would use it the way he would have wanted. When Mr. Harrison finished reading, Jessica was crying, but not from sadness, from pure rage. She said I had poisoned Frank against them, that I had spent all that time with him just to make sure I got everything. Brandon tried to talk about legal options, asked about the possibility of proving undue influence. Kyle said this was unfair, that 70 acres of land plus $200,000 was too much, that I didn't deserve all that when they had worked so hard in their lives. Nathan said something about how this was going to destroy the family, as if the family had been so united before this. My father finally looked directly at me and asked what I was going to do about it. I told him the truth, that I was going to respect and Frank's wishes, that I was going to keep the property and take care of it like he would have wanted. My father said that was selfish, that I should consider sharing at least part of the inheritance with my siblings. I told him that if they had wanted something from Frank, maybe they should have spent time with him while he was alive instead of completely ignoring him. That basically ended the meeting. Everyone left furious. Jessica screaming at me in the parking lot that I was a thief and a manipulator. Kyle saying this wasn't over. Nathan, just looking at me with that cold expression he has when he's planning something. My mother was the last to leave. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked if I was really going to do this, if I was really going to take everything and leave my family with nothing. I reminded her they hadn't left anything for Frank when he needed them, and she just shook her head and left. The next few days were a nightmare. I got constant calls and messages from everyone. Jessica sent me long texts about how I had destroyed the family, about how her kids weren't going to have the opportunities they deserved because their selfish uncle had kept everything. Kyle called me at all hours trying to negotiate, saying if I gave him at least 20 acres, we could forget about all the drama. Nathan sent me a formal email, very professional, basically threatening legal action if I didn't consider a more equitable division of the assets. My father, being a lawyer, called me to have a serious conversation about the legal and family consequences of my actions. He explained that although the will was technically valid, there were ways to dispute it, and if I was smart, I'd find a way to resolve this amicably before things got ugly. I told him there was nothing to resolve, that Frank had made his decision, and I was going to respect it. 2 weeks after the reading of the will, something happened that I probably should have anticipated. I had installed security cameras on the property, not because I was being paranoid, but because it was a sensible measure for such a remote place. One afternoon, I got an alert on my phone. The cameras had detected movement. When I checked the video, there were my mother, Jessica, and Brandon trying to get into the cabin. Brandon was trying to force the back door, while Jessica looked through the windows, and my mother was standing there like she didn't know what to do. I called them immediately. My phone connected to the cameras allowed me to speak through a speaker, and I told them I was watching them, to leave immediately or I'd call the police. They froze, looking around trying to find the cameras, and then basically ran to their car. Jessica called me 10 minutes later screaming that they just wanted to see the property, that they had a right to be there because it was family property. I explained that no, that legally, the property was mine, and that if they tried to enter again without permission, I was going to report them for trespassing. That didn't stop the negotiation attempts. Jessica showed up at the factory where I work, waiting for me in the parking lot after my shift. She offered me $100,000 for the property, cash, no questions asked. I told her the property was easily worth $400,000 or more, probably close to $500,000 with the improvements Frank had made, and that even if I wanted to sell, it wouldn't be to her, and definitely not for that price. She started crying, saying Brandon and she really needed this, that they had debts, that the kids needed certain things. I told her maybe they should reconsider their lifestyle instead of trying to steal my inheritance. Kyle tried a different approach. He invited me to lunch, very friendly, like we were brothers who get along. During the whole meal, he talked about business opportunities, about how we could work together, maybe develop part of the land, build something there. I kept saying no, that the property was going to stay as it was, that was Frank's wish. At the end of lunch, Kyle dropped the friendly mask and told me I was being stupid, that I didn't have the capacity to maintain a property like that eventually I was going to have to sell, and when that happened, they weren't going to be there to help me. The situation reached its lowest point about 2 months after the reading of the will. I got a call from Mr. Harrison saying he needed to see me immediately, that something serious had come up. When I got to his office, he looked genuinely concerned. He showed me a document Nathan had submitted, supposedly a more recent version of Frank's will that divided the assets more equitably among all family members. The problem was obvious even to me, who's not a lawyer. The document was a terrible forgery. Frank's signature looked wrong, like someone had tried to copy it but not very well. And the date on the document was only 2 weeks before Frank died, a time when he could barely hold a pencil, much less sign legal documents. Mr. Harrison had already notified the authorities, he explained, and had initiated an investigation into the origin of the document. I felt like I'd been punched. One thing was fighting over money. It was ugly but understandable in a way. But forging a will was something else entirely. It was a real crime. I called Nathan immediately, furious, and he acted like he had no idea what I was talking about, said he was just trying to ensure Frank's true wishes were fulfilled, that he had found that document among Frank's things and was just presenting it as was his duty. I told him it was a lie, that Frank hadn't signed that document, that it was obviously fake and he knew it. Nathan got defensive, started saying things about how I had manipulated Frank, about how they were just trying to correct an injustice. I told him he could say whatever he wanted, that the authorities were going to investigate, and when they discovered he had forged that document, he was going to face real consequences, not just family drama. The investigation took about a month. It turned out Nathan had paid someone to create the document, someone who apparently wasn't very good at forgeries because the signature was notoriously fake when compared to real examples of Frank's handwriting. Mr. Harrison had documents signed by Frank from only weeks before the supposed fake will, and the difference was obvious. There were also medical records showing Frank was on strong medication at the dates of the fake document, which made it extremely unlikely he would have been in any condition to sign legal documents. Nathan was formally charged with document forgery and fraud. My father, being a lawyer, tried to defend him, argued it had been a misunderstanding, that Nathan had genuinely believed the document was real. But the evidence was too clear. There were records of payments from Nathan to the person who had created the document, text, messages discussing the details. In the end, Nathan took a deal, pleaded guilty to lesser charges, received a considerable fine and community service, and had to make a public statement admitting what he had done. That was basically the final point for me. I cut contact with my entire family. I blocked their numbers, their emails, their social media. I told Mr. Harrison that any communication from them had to go through him, that I didn't want to know anything about any of them. My mother tried to show up at the cabin one more time, just her, without Jessica or Brandon, and she found me there working on some roof repairs. She stood there for a moment, and then started crying, saying she didn't understand how we had gotten to this point, that we were family and family should stick together. I told her the truth, that they had never treated me like family, that I had always been the failure, the embarrassment, the one who didn't meet expectations, that the only person who had accepted me as I was had been Frank, and that they had completely ignored him until they knew he had something they wanted. I told her it wasn't me who had destroyed this family, that they had done it long before Frank died, and that now I was simply acknowledging what had always been true, that I had never really been part of this family to begin with. My mother left crying, and that was the last time I talked to any of them. It's been like 6 months since then. I moved permanently to Frank's cabin, or well, My cabin now, I guess. I used part of the money Frank left to make the necessary repairs, fixed the roof, updated the plumbing, installed a solar system for electricity. I still work as a welder, but now I work independently, take projects when I want, and do hunting guides on the property on weekends. Maisie, Frank's dog, is living out her last years here with me. She's like 13 years old now, moves slowly, but she still likes to sit on the porch and look at the trees. Sometimes I sit there, with her, in the same chair where Frank used to sit, and I think about all the conversations we had, all the things he taught me. And I wonder what he would think of all this, of how his family showed their true nature after he was gone. I think he already knew. Honestly. I think that's why he changed his will. Not just to give me something, but to force everyone to show who they really were. And they did, in the clearest way possible. Jessica with her desperate greed, Kyle with his manipulation attempts, Nathan literally committing fraud, my father choosing to defend Nathan instead of doing the right thing, my mother caught between her love for me and her loyalty to them. I don't regret anything. Some people have told me I should have been the bigger person, that I should have shared at least something with my siblings to keep the peace. But peace was never a real option. Not with people like that. If I had shared, I would have only sent the message that their behavior was okay, that they could ignore someone their whole life and then expect to benefit from their death. Frank made his decision because I was the only one who was there, the only one who cared, and I'm going to honor that decision no matter how much my family hates me for it. The property is beautiful, by the way. Frank's 70 acres, well, mine now, are basically my own little paradise. There's a lake where I fish almost every morning, woods where I hunt in season, and the cabin that I've slowly turned into a real home. It's ironic, I think, that they thought I didn't have the resources or capacity to maintain this place, when in reality, I'm probably the only person in the family who actually could. I know how to fix things, how to build, how to live simply without needing the elaborate lifestyle they think is necessary. I've started making friends in the nearest town, people who really understand this lifestyle, who value simple things. It's funny how I found more family among strangers in these last a few months than I had in 24 years with my blood family. And maybe that's what Frank wanted me to learn, that family isn't just about sharing last names or DNA, it's about who's there when it really matters. Who shows up not because they have to, but because they want to. So here I am, living in my great-uncle's cabin, with his old dog by my side, working on my own terms, and honestly happier than I've been in years. My family can hate me all they want. They can talk about me at their family dinners. They can tell their version of the story where I'm the villain who manipulated a sick old man. I don't care because I know the truth. Mr. Harrison knows the truth. And wherever Frank is, he knows the truth too. And at the end of the day, that's enough for me.